Ready?
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to today's online forum. My name is Holly McPhail here with the Florida League of Cities, and we are excited to welcome you today for Community Policing and Public Opinion. This is a quarterly discussion on public opinion that will be repeated every 3 months as part of a monthly recurring leadership, ethics, and public opinion series that will be headed up by our very own Dr. Scott Payne, our Director with the Leadership Development and Education with FLCU University. Before we get started and introduce our guest speaker, I just want to remind everyone on the call or right-hand side dashboard that will show you, if you can scroll through, you'll see a couple of options, and one says handouts, and it'll be published there shortly, as well as I will attach it to an email at the conclusion of today's call. Finally, this is an interactive discussion. It's not just kind of us kind of talking heads up here sharing with you guys. We want to have your questions, so there's a couple of ways that you can submit those questions. One is you can use the question icon in your right-hand dashboard on your screen, or there's a chat function. Either way to submit your questions, and we'll take those as we go along throughout today's call. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Scott Payne.
Thank you, Holly. I appreciate it, and this is a privilege to be able to start having these conversations monthly about issues we hope will be important to you, and hope that you will, in fact, send questions. We'd be delighted to be engaging with you over the course of this afternoon. Our topics for today include one that we knew was important to begin with, and unfortunately recent events remind us of just how important it is. We'll spend a lot of time this afternoon talking about Floridians' perceptions of policing and the police, in particular looking at Floridians, not just the national perspective. As time permits, we're also going to talk about something that we can't avoid in this present season, a campaign season. We are inundated with election polls, it seems like every day, and it seems like every day the headline is different than the day before, so we'll take a little time to try to unpack the basics of how to interpret those election polls. With me is Steve Vancore. He's going to be our expert on the poll and on polling for us this afternoon. Steve has almost 30 years of experience doing research on voters and on voting behavior, conducting polls and focus groups and developing strategies here in the state of Florida. As you can see, also, he is an adjunct professor in the Masters of Applied American Policy and Politics at Florida State University, and the co-host up here in the Tallahassee region of The Usual Suspects on the local CBS affiliate. Thanks for being with us, Steve.
Oh, I appreciate you having me. This is an exciting part. I'm looking at the thing. One part is very serious and kind of somber. The other part, election polls and polling season, should be a lot of fun.
And we might find ourselves laughing at some of the latest flip-flops in those numbers. But Steve, let's get right into the topic we're going to talk about first, which is about police and public perceptions of policing. Oh, Holly already did the sending us your questions. That was, please get back. So just a little bit, obviously we all know this is an important issue because we've been talking about it nationally, and unfortunately this week we had multiple incidents and we've had some violence in Charlotte. So we're all concerned about how the public understands what's happening in the relationship between various parts of the community and our public safety officers. So what was the particular project that you undertook?
Well, this began at a meeting we had with a group. Many of you may be familiar with the Florida Urban Partnership, which is the large city mayors. And they were, during the conversations, expressing concerns about what's happening relative to policing. My gosh, today, again, it's top of the fold news, and wanted to recognize that nobody that they knew of at least had not published and shared observations. How is the public perceiving this? What do they like? What do they dislike? What are their fears? What are their hopes? Who do they trust? Who do they not trust? How do different demographic parts of our community respond and feel differently or similarly about different issues. And I'll tell you, Scott, this year alone, our firm just logged our 75th poll of the year on a variety of topics. I have to say unequivocally, this is the most interesting, and I learned more from this poll than I think I've learned from any other poll about public perception. Sometimes it's just head-to-head in a race or whatever, but I really feel like we understand their fears and anxieties and where they come from as a result of these polls.
We probably should start at the top with what you actually did. So tell everyone a little bit about this particular poll.
To have about 3.5% margin of error for each question. Now you'll see that margin of error is almost meaningless when you see these incredible gaps that we're gonna examine here. But a scientifically valid poll throughout this using live operators, making sure 20% of the sample were cell phones, and it was evenly distributed throughout the state.
And what specifically did you look into in the results that we're going to look
Well, we looked into, and I'll start at the end because I think that's what we want to know. The purpose of this is to, what can you take away from this? We found, of course, near and far. And what we found was it's a riotous, chaotic condition, a lot of anxiety, for example. When you ask them about your own community, high levels of comfort. When you say, how about your own neighborhood? Universal, I feel safe in my own neighborhood. And that cuts across all demographics, male, female, black, white, rich, poor. Interestingly, throughout the survey, what we found was feel things are very unsafe. The more they feel there's degrees of discord in the community. And what we found was very interesting on that is a lot of that's driven, this higher, no surprise, by the level of TV viewership.
Yeah.
The more people watch television, there's a concept called windows on the world. If you're a non-television viewer, you may miss some of this stuff. Even if you're on social media, you don't see the videos, you don't see some of that stuff. So your perception of what's around you is driven largely by what you see from your likely to believe that. We found that explicitly in this poll, and I know, Holly, you're posting up the results so people can download that and read it at their leisure. So the near and far concept, the closer to home, the better they felt, and I think that's a good thing for cities and those who run cities to know the anxiety is necessarily back home. We'll talk about how to use that in a little bit. So go to the next slide. Another example is police misconduct is a problem. You can see right here in my community, only 1 in 5 respondents felt that way, yet 6 in 10, a 40-point gap, felt police misconduct is a problem in the nation. That's for those of you who don't do polling, Scott's
absolutely huge. And I'm sorry, just to be clear, we're talking about the same respondent answering these 2 questions.
And answering them scrambled and far apart so there's no ordering effect, okay? So we rotate the questions so we know this is statistically a very, very large gap. But hang on to the banisters because I'm going to show you some crazy gaps. Okay, so the next issue is an issue I call black and white. There is a large perception gap, an uncomfortably large perception gap as to what's happening in the nation and why and who they trust and don't trust between white respondents and black respondents. So for example, how do you feel about the favorability? How do you feel about police officers throughout the country? We have a standard scale that we use because I feel very favorable towards them, somewhat favorable. Now, it's nice to, I thought the gap would have been even larger. Basically half of black voters, by the way, please forgive me, I will call these respondents who are not necessarily voters, I will call them voters throughout. It's in the middle of election season, I'm a pollster, guess I'm talking
about voters all the time.
So I promise you I will make that slip up about 1,000 times.
Right. We're looking at the questions you're asking, and someone might look at that statement and say, well, that's really inflammatory. Too many police officers think they can get away. Why is this the approach to unpacking people's perceptions of public safety officers and public safety?
Very good. If you ask a bunch of generic vanilla questions, what you're going to get is a bunch of generic vanilla responses. You have to sometimes push the limits on both sides, and we did. By the way, this was jointly done with my firm, who predominantly works, I'd say neutral territory, but then leans with Democratic candidates. When you do legislative races, you have to pick a side.
Right.
And we jointly did this with Consensus Communications, an excellent polling firm out of Central Florida. We worked with Ryan Houck with them to make sure that we were testing those stressors on both sides of the equation. But that's a really excellent point. So sometimes you do ask inflammatory questions to see what kind of pushback you get. So thank you for asking that. So police officers are not as well trained as in years past. What I was trying to measure here, Scott, was change over time. Do they see this as a new problem or an old problem? And because people will say, well, they've been poorly trained then and they're poorly trained now, you're going to get moved to neutral. Again, you see a better than 2-to-1 gap between black voters. By the way, what makes these numbers so stark is a variety of people will have no opinion on these, and that's a tempering factor statistically. So when you see these kind of gaps, recognize that's probably out of only about 80 or 85% of the respondents, because people, well, I don't really know. Maybe that's just something they're not thinking about. They're busy working 2 jobs, they're busy worrying about their family, or they're genuinely confused about the issue. But you see 60 to 25, another big gap on how the public perceives protests. Okay, the black respondents are likely to say these are good. We need to call attention to these things. I think what you're seeing is more and more white respondents. It makes them nervous, and what they're worried about is will this spill over into my neighborhood? Go on. This is important for consensus. How is the perceived role of media? The media has overblown many of these recent stories, and you can see the gap there as well. So we walk through this generally, but here's the convergence of hope. I mean, at some level, it could be sad to say, oh my gosh, we live in two different countries. But when you reframe some of these questions and you bring things closer to home, look at the level of agreement. So this does give me a sense of hope that there are ways we can reconcile in disparate communities and find points of common agreement. And what you see here is the closer to home things are, the more likely they are to be unified. So for example, the favorability, how do you feel about your local mayor? And for the mayors on the call, we've done this for the Florida Urban Partnership, the Florida League of Mayors. They always get a big smile at that first slide, right? That there's some universality that people generally like their mayor, and it's not as high as they would like it to be, but you see it's only a gap. You would just witness 30, 40, 50-point gaps. There's only a 6-point gap.
And we should note as well that in a context where political leaders in many areas and political institutions in many areas are not generally viewed favorably, to be above the 50% mark
is ridiculous.
They're doing really well.
Well, you know, it's funny. You know, it's not how rich I am; it's how poor the other guy is, right? When you put this in comparison to favorability of Congress, it's about 9%. So feel even better. But the truth is, no joking around, you're running against that public perception where people will lump in all politicians into that. Look at crime and safety locally being on the right track, lower than you would like it, but only a 10-point gap there, 11-point gap on trust your local police chief, but notice it's trending upward. The trust of the local police chief is really important, that people feel that their local folks, both police officers and the police chief in particular, pretty good numbers right there, especially given the backdrop of where we are and how much. And look at black voters in particular. 66%, they're feeling a high degree of anxiety about policing nationally. You saw it on the other polls. For them, for 2/3 of them to say, well, I do trust my local police chief, speaks very well. You know, I know as those of you who run cities, who are mayors of cities, you sometimes wonder, is it worth it? Is the work we're doing, is the extra training we're doing, is the systems we're putting in place, is it making a difference? I think you've got proof positive right there that when you see 81% of black voters feel like the local police in their own community, 4 in 5 have something good to say, yeah, the work you're doing is really making a difference, and that's important. And then finally, do you feel safe in your own neighborhood? Pretty good numbers right there as well.
And before we move on, so there's, as you've noted here, there's a very large contrast between the slides we were looking at before, the series of about 5, contrasting the perceptions of black respondents and white respondents when the questions were asked generically, when they were the broad-based level of trust in the police, things going the wrong way. Then when we focus it on the local level, they feel much more comfortable. We still obviously in some areas have some work to do. So in your assessment, and the poll may not tell us this, but in your assessment, what is this contrast we're seeing? Why is it so much, why is the difference in perception so great, seemingly greater for black respondents and white respondents between the local community and?
Because what they're seeing, where they're created anxiety is created, is what they're seeing has happening nationally. Because remember, if something happens in Ferguson or Charlotte or New York or Philadelphia or San Francisco, it arrives in your living room, on your television set. And so then you see that as a representative sample of what's happening across the nation. Now, back in your own community, you're reading your local newspapers, and so if these things aren't falling apart, if there's not chaos in your local community, you're more likely to say, okay, things are okay here, but my God, they're going to hell in a handbasket nationally. I'm reminded of a study I read one time where there were a number of kidnappings around the country, and then people were freaking out about kidnappings. Local communities are putting all these programs in place, but when in actuality, the number of kidnappings had not changed. Contrast that to the shark bite. Remember the summer of shark bites?
Yeah.
The actual number of shark bites had not changed, but the coverage of shark. Now, I'm not saying things are going well in the country. I think we can all agree there's bad things happening, and it is a genuine, honest, real problem. but it's magnified by people who watch more TV and what they're seeing happening in the nation. By the way, if you read any of the Nielsen reports, the people who monitor television viewership, interesting correlation, black Americans watch TV about 40 to 70% more than white Americans do, and probably double what Hispanic Americans do. So that, I think, furthers that narrative. And it's an economic-driven issue, that it's a cheaper form of entertainment, but I think that adds to that variable as well. So, but the difference here is what I see and hear about locally versus what I see and hear about nationally, and the media by which I see and hear that.
And when we talk about the local level, I'm assuming that a lot of these responses that we see in the Convergence of Hope slide are driven by people's own experience, as opposed to the media coverage. It's the contact they've had with a law enforcement officer in the community, what they hear from their friends, or maybe their own contact with the mayor, with the local government. The media plays less of a role, and of course we know television media in particular plays less of a role in providing people information about what's happening in their own local community. So,
perfectly said. I had nothing to add.
So what we're seeing is, as you said, there's some hope here. We have clearly some major challenges to deal with in terms of what is a perception gap. And of course, none of us, what we all hope is that our community will not be a community where we have a tragedy like they're dealing with in Charlotte. That said, I think there's that larger conversation, and you addressed it in the survey, but what are the kinds of things that public leaders, especially local leaders, need to be saying, and who should be saying it to help the community, among other things, maintain perspective, even if nothing happens that goes badly, to help people understand what this evidence shows us. We need to remember what our own communities actually are like and not get too wrapped up in what the national coverage is presenting to us. And if something goes wrong, who are the right people to talk to?
Well, it's a perfect segue, because other than the obvious, which is, better training, better communication, nonstop communication, I've been beating this drum for people who, agencies that are not engaging on social media and finding ways to communicate with the public, they're ignoring a large swath of the population, and you're letting somebody else communicate on your behalf.
Right.
That's a whole other seminar. Maybe we could do that one day, about engaging a younger population and not letting everything they hear about you come from a third party, which may not always be on your side, okay? But so who do they trust? I mean, it becomes immediately obvious, because there's two parts to every message, right? Who's the messenger, and then what are you saying? We won't spend a lot of time on that. The more local, and this will vary by community to community. In some places you have a very popular local mayor. Some places you have a very popular or highly regarded local police chief. I was pleased to see that having somebody in uniform was still your best bet. But local mayors are also, are seen as the chief of police in many communities. Obviously, a very good voice, assuming, and here's the critical part, if the first time they hear from you is after a crisis, that's a bad problem. So let's talk about what is it people want, and we're going to go to the element of when something bad happens, right? What they want, and I can't stress this part enough. Localize the issue. Localize the issue. Take it out of the frame of the national conversation. And when we were meeting with the mayor of St. Petersburg and his team, it was great. We used the example. We said, Rick, I go back a long way with him, so I can call him. Rick, if there's an incident in St. Petersburg, it's not an incident in St. Petersburg. It's not even an incident in this particular neighborhood. You want to localize this to the GPS coordinates if possible. And why would you want to do that? Why would you want to localize it to a street corner? Because if I say to the public, in other words, your first press conference is not at City Hall, which brings it up to 3,000 feet, right? If the nation is 30,000 feet, you don't want to have your first press conference at City Hall. You want to have it where it happened. Why is that? So the people out in the suburbs or the outlying areas will immediately know, oh, okay, I'm still safe in my own neighborhood, okay? And then when you look at the black-white issue, and I'm just going to use the example as though this were in a black neighborhood, okay, that the black community wants something a little different than the white community wants. They want to know you care and you're taking care of business for them, okay? So if you show up in that neighborhood you're going to be better received that I care about you, I'm here, at the same time giving comfort to everybody else in the community that, okay, things are under control, it's not in my neighborhood, I don't have to worry as much. And then that should guide so much more of your actions. Who are the community leaders there? Who needs to be touched, and how often do they need to be touched? Interestingly, we found that white voters, white respondents, did not want to be touched a lot. They just want to know it's all being taken care of, somebody's got it under control, it's not going to spill over into my neighborhood. Where we found overwhelming in Black and Hispanic, they want near daily updates. They want to know you're talking to community leaders, you're engaged with community leaders. At some level I understand, because one, if it becomes riotous, if it becomes chaos on the streets, it's their neighborhoods, it's their business that are going to be affected. Okay, so I can't stress to you, rule number 1, 2, 3, and 4 is to localize the issue as much as possible. The other one is common sense. They want to hear immediately, even if you don't have all the information, they want to know that you're engaged here. So the idea that, well, we're not going to have a press conference till we have all the information, you're going to create anxiety in your constituents. They want to see your face, whether it's the face of the local police chief and or the local mayor, saying, here's what we know. I think the model is Rudy Giuliani after 9/11. He was out front saying things like, look, I don't have all the information. Let me tell you exactly what I know, exactly what the source is. And he set the model for crisis response. Use that model. Get out there, be seen often. And what was always the backdrop for Rudy Giuliani? There were people with dust on their faces when he was talking, and that's where you want to be. You want to be seen on the street, so voters, respondents see you care and you're engaged at a level they care about.
So that sounds like, from the standpoint of where you want to hold that press conference, it's not only in the location, but you want to be sure there's crime tape, or they're the flashing lights of police cruisers or something, so everyone realizes why you are where you are, and to realize, okay, this is the location.
Correct.
Rather than some formal setting.
Correct.
The other thing that you said, I just want to reinforce, when you talk with Giuliani, he was very careful only to describe as facts things that he had every reason to believe based on all the evidence were factual. He was quick to say, we don't know everything yet. Here's what we know.
Right.
And that's another
And as soon as I get that information, I will get back with you on it, and then did, okay? The other elements we checked, whether you want to do this or not will be up to you, but they like the idea that a citizens advisory committee or some sort of citizen oversight is engaged, whether that's a pre-existing citizens committee or a committee that's formed to evaluate it based on the community that's involved. They like that. Now, I'm not recommending that necessarily as a policy, because I recognize very clearly how that can come back to bite you. Have a clear community outreach plan in place beforehand, and then execute it to the maximum extent practicable. We also tested, because, and I know this is going to make a lot of people gnash their teeth, body cameras are extraordinarily popular. People like them, they want them, and they tend to trust the information on video, even while saying, and it almost would seem like it's cognitive dissonance, even while saying, I recognize that sometimes video can be misleading, sometimes video doesn't tell the whole story, but at the end of the day, they like having video evidence, they like seeing the video, and the more you hold that back, this is what we also learned, the more you hold that back, the more likely they are to believe that you're holding critical information from them. And that's an unfortunate element of the world we live in today.
So let's talk just for a moment about that, because obviously we've had examples where the video has come out, and I'm thinking way back, I'm thinking of the Rodney King incident and how much it was people's perceptions of that, in addition to being influenced by race and some other considerations, were influenced by whether they watched the video run in real time from beginning to end or watched it in slow motion, the differences in people's perceptions of the video. So acknowledging that, if you're a sports fan, you watch the replay and you watch it in slow motion, so wait a second, how long was the ball in the glove kinds of conversations. What can a mayor, what can a police department, what can a public information officer do so that when you're having to deal with a video that is not unambiguous, that person can help the press and the community better process the information and think about what it is they're seeing?
Well, that's a really difficult challenge because if the video is bad, it's going to get out. You might as well let it out and then show the action you're taking in response to the video that you're seeing, and put it in context and say, listen, I want to show you this video. It's cringeworthy. It's horrible. The officer in question, and I'm thinking of a couple of incidents I worked on. We were hired by various police departments to help them with their lawsuits when there was video. Just you got to get it out there because it's going to make its way eventually. And if you're seen as hiding it or covering it, that's bad. Now I recognize if there's some union contracts and all but prohibit that. That's a very difficult challenge. To the maximum extent practicable, get it out there, but put it in context and let them see the whole video, understanding, window on the world, understanding 6 o'clock news ain't going to show the 8-minute clip.
Right, exactly.
They're not going to show
3 seconds.
We had an incident in Leon County where this woman was apparently under the influence of drugs, drove a car at 2 o'clock in the morning into the living room of a home. After 2 hours of fighting the police, kicking out a window, escaping from her handcuffs, the officer went to make the third arrest of her as she was trying to escape, went to put her onto the car. She kicked his leg and ended up being a face slam into the cement. And that 7-second video was awful. Yep. It was awful. And so maybe you have the opportunity to put it in context a little bit, but if you're defending a video that makes you cringe, you're on the wrong side of that communications thing. I'm not saying sell your police officers out, but that's going to get out there, treat it accordingly. And don't try to hide it because this is the takeaway here. If the public knows there's a video out there and you're not sharing it, the default assumption is you've done something wrong or somebody's done something wrong, and now you're making it worse by covering it up.
And we've had multiple examples around the country where that delay in
it's happening now.
Charlotte's facing that issue right now.
And so the last point is, and this is hopefully self-evident, is you must, because of the racial gaps we see in perception, because of the racial gaps you see in perception, you must acknowledge that in your media and handling of the media. Whether if you have an all-black police force and a black mayor and a black police chief, and you need to have some white faces with you, likewise in reverse as well. You need to have because people see the messengers and how they react to that. If take for example, it happens in a black community and you got a white mayor and a white police chief and a white spokesperson, there's going to be some misperceptions. The words that are coming out of your mouth may not matter. Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message. Keep that in mind, that who is speaking oftentimes matters as much as what that person is saying. So by recognizing the gap in public perception, the unfortunate racial gap we see from this poll and other indicators, keep that in mind as you develop your communications plan.
And if you don't, I guess if you don't currently have people in those positions who are diverse, that might be an additional motivation in the near term. Obviously, we focus on
so far, you talked about the role of TV media. What about social media? Is it hurting or helping?
It's going to vary, but by and large, it's going to hurt for two specific reasons. One, social media, despite what Marshall McLuhan thought when he predicted the internet, is actually creating more silos, not fewer. And so what's happening is people are seeking out reaffirmation of their prior held opinion. So if you begin from a position of negativity, you're gonna only reinforce that and harden that opinion. And where social media hurts is that happens quicker than ever before. We joke about, like debates coming up, right? Monday night presidential debates. What the impact of the debate is never felt until the debate conversation makes it to the water cooler. Okay, but that water cooler conversation We're tweeting live during the debate, so the water cooler conversations begin happening immediately. They don't have to wait till the next day at the office, okay? So in that regard, social media and digital media is hurting. It's also hurting in this regard. I believe government in particular is lagging in this arena, and government in particular has been very slow to embrace the use of multi-platform digital media. I remember giving a presentation for the League of Mayors, the League of Cities on this, and the first question was, so you expect my staff to tweet? And I said, well, does your staff talk? Do they speak at the water cooler? Do they go to cocktail parties? Do they have friends over for dinner? You can't control what they say there, but if you gave them guidance and opportunity and you had an aggressive outreach program, yeah, I do. Secondly, we did those millennial 2 years ago with Mayor Mosley. It was her thing to understand the role of millennials. They were saying, well, I would never follow my local police department. They have nothing of interest to say. Then I said, I had 8 things. I said, well, if they gave you traffic reports and updates where crashes were, would you follow that? Oh, yeah. If they told you where speed traps were, which is important for police officers, and they like doing that because people slow down. That's the objective.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I would totally do that. How about if they said there's a street closure because there's a 5K happening in your neighborhood tomorrow? Would you do that? Oh, absolutely. And so when we met with the sheriffs and we met with police officers, we said, here's the 18 things you can have on a regular calendar. And why is that important, Holly? Because if the first time I hear from my local police office is in defense of something going bad, I don't have a relationship with them. But if they're constantly providing me information about a lightning strike, a burglary happening here, a street closure, a 5K, I feel like I have a relationship with these people so that the first time they hear from me isn't, now the police shooting, that guy had a gun, we promise, you're not going to believe me. So in the aggregate, I have to say, and I know some municipalities in particular, because they usually are the leading edge of innovation, are beginning to do more and more of that. But by and large, counties, cities are not doing enough of that to communicate with their people.
And since social media is designed to be about relationship, that's why it's social media. That's building that connection, so it's not just about the essential information in the crisis. It's an ongoing conversation.
And I'll just make a super quick pitch for the social media toolkit that's on the FLC website, that if you are interested in building it or wanting to know where to start or any of that, whether you're talking about Twitter or Facebook, or even some of the other mediums that are out there, there's lots of resources available on the FLC website.
And I would say this, if you're especially a police force, they did an experiment in the New York City police force, and it was a dismal failure.
You're talking about the
cute little Facebook post. Listen, just because Scott's right, it's social, don't be goofy. I don't want my municipality to be goofy. That feels like a waste of taxpayer money. Be utilitarian. Do what you do best. Okay, inform, engage the public on things that will matter to them. And it doesn't mean, hey, the city commission is meeting, we're doing our budget workshop. There's a lot of ways that cities can tell people a park is now reopening. We just rebuilt these trails. Little League sign up is next week. There's 100 things you could put on your social media calendar that are utilitarian without trying to be goofy and fun. That's not the role of a police force. That should not be, in my professional opinion, not be the role of a municipality.
And I'll also pitch that through FLC University, we also do courses in social media for municipalities, and I want to encourage people to, if they're interested in that, to contact us, and we'll schedule one for you where you are in the Orlando Training Center.
And you can't not do it, because it is the way people communicate now. And it used to be just those young millennials. Well, guess what, folks? In 5 years, those millennials are going to be 40. Most of our mayors are 40. Okay? So they're getting older and they're engaged, and that ain't changing. They're not going to start watching regular TV all over again. That's a permanent part, and we're seeing a very, very rapid growth up to 50 as well. So keep that in mind. It's here to stay.
I want to pick up a comment you made as we transition to the other topic here. And again, Holly, if you see another question come through, by all means, Jeff.
Just one question came through. Would you be willing to share the list of 18 things that you shared with the sheriffs and police chiefs? Is that something that our attendees today?
Of course. I'll have to find it. It was a
you don't have it all at the top of your head?
Yeah,
right there.
It was a seminar we gave in Central Florida to 200 police chiefs about a year ago. remind me, and I'll be happy to share that. Yeah.
So for the attendees listening, I'll follow up with Steve and send that out to you.
And just for the record, it may not be exactly 18. 18 was a metaphor for a large number.
A large, well, and I think that also suggests that might be, again, an interesting topic to talk about down the road. We do something on social media and public perception.
Engagement.
We might include that piece.
Yeah.
But something you said, you were looking at the polling results, and you talk about potential suggestions of trends. And of course, this particular survey conducted in February this year, right, was a one-shot. It was a snapshot of where we are in Florida. You asked some questions that invited people to reflect on their experience. But there's a difference between a snapshot poll asking people about the past and things we're seeing now in some of the election stuff, these tracking polls where they do a poll and then another 2 weeks later they do a poll. Help people understand what we can learn about change in opinion from a single poll versus a series of polls.
Well, oh boy, there's several facets to this. One is, if you were to read the press, you'd think the public is just jolting back and forth on their opinion.
Yeah.
The reality of it is most polls that are out there for public consumption are not real polls. They're not conducted with a level of scientific explicitity, is that a word? A scientific detail necessary for actual predictive behavior, okay? They're done very cheaply, and they're done for entertainment value. Now, is there stuff you can learn from that? Of course. You can see trending. There are poll aggregators which take that into mind, because if you do poll one way versus another, you could start to look at trends. So, for example, did Hillary have a bad 2 weeks? Absolutely. 2 weeks ago, her electoral college advantage was well into the 300s. Most analysts now have her right at about 270, right, which is what she needs to win, but it's the numbers have truly changed. But when you see one day Quinnipiac has a poll, the next day CNN Orc have a poll, the next day Monmouth has a poll, the reason for the differences is usually due to the methodology they employ. Sometimes they do robopolls, which eliminates cell phones. Sometimes they do live caller phones, but to do it cheaply, and you'll see this line. If you see this line in a story about a poll, discount it completely. They'll say, they did 1,000 sample, blah, 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 but among likely voters, these are the results. Now, wait a second. Why are we even talking to people who are not even voters or not even likely voters? That makes no sense. That's like having a car dealership that sells Mercedes-Benz and saying, but who might be able to afford a Mercedes-Benz is their opinion. I only want to know the opinion of those. So let me just give you some quick thumbnails on how to determine whether a poll is valid and reliable. Valid means the dart came close to its target. Reliable means if you do the same methodology over and over again, the dart will hit at about the same place. And so what you're looking for in a poll is validity and reliability. Can you replicate those findings? So the two things to keep in mind, one is randomness. Is the poll, and I didn't even know that was the next slide. Given this,
we knew where you were going here.
So what randomness means is that you took everybody who's a likely voter, okay, whether it's a Democratic primary in Senate District 1 or a Republican primary. You're always going to get a bad sample, because who's going to select themselves? The people who are angry, people who are activists, people who are engaged. That's not a good way to do a poll. So is it random? The second thing is it representative? Does it look like the population? Did I get a good number from Miami? Did I get a good number from Pensacola, from the Panhandle? Is it balanced by what we think the turnout's going to be, by party, by gender, by age? And so there should be a statement explaining that the poll looks like the universe. one of the problems in a presidential election, we really don't know what the turnout's going to be like. We can look at past behavior, we can look at how numbers are coming in, and we know in Florida the number of Democrats and Republicans will be about equal. The Democrats should slightly outnumber the Republicans. It doesn't mean the Democrat will win, as we know, because a lot of Democrats vote Republican.
Plus, you have all these no party affiliation.
Well, and you have a growing number of no party affiliations, which will be about a quarter of the electorate. But sometimes you'll see, and this is my favorite, they'll say, then we ask people to identify themselves. Now, many of you don't know who I am, but if you did, you'd know that I'm 6 foot tall, I have a full head of hair, and killer ass. That's what I want to be, okay?
Right.
That's not what I actually am. And likewise, there's a lot of voters who are actually Democrats, but right now maybe like Donald Trump and want to identify as a lot of voters are fed up, don't like either candidate, so in the context of the presidential are going to say, I don't belong to either party. Well, that's not how, that's fine to know that information, but it's not fine to balance that information, because I know about 34% of the electorate on election, about 38% of the electorate on election will be Democrat. And about 37% will be Republican, okay? So it's not how you want to be, it's how you are. And that's an important element when evaluating the poll. So one, random, was it random? Was it representative? The other benchmark is, did they attempt cell phones? The reason a lot of these media polls don't attempt cell phones, as a pollster, I can tell you this, it's very expensive. You can't automatic dial them, and you got to pay toll both ways. So each cell phone about triples my cost per completion. So to do a 400 sample, if I get 4 times about 80 completions by cell, that's going to be about half the cost of my poll is doing those 20 to 30% cell phones. So that's why you see a lot of these made for entertainment value polls not having cell phones. If you don't have cell phones in your poll, you're missing a significant part of the electorate. It goes back to my randomness. You've excluded somebody from your poll who is different than the rest of the universe. So that's an important element there. And I'm happy to answer any questions about polling.
And I think that's actually the next, or there it is on the slide.
Yeah.
No, it's good. You're right with it. You made the comment a moment ago about representativeness, and it's here as the second bullet. And I think it may be helpful for our audience folks who don't spend all their time on public opinion to really get their heads around this. When we're doing a public opinion survey about people's attitudes about whatever, smoking.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So it's the public of the United States, and we draw a good sample, do all those kinds of things. Well, we know what that population is, and we know how many people in the United States, roughly. We know how many adults are asking their opinion about an issue or a particular behavior or a taste. But when we're talking about voting, you've made the comment, we don't really know what that population looks like. And the note here says until after Election Day. What's going on? What's the difference between a conventional public opinion poll and an election poll?
So when you look at and you evaluate 5 pollsters, and I did this actually at the annual conference of the League of Cities a couple of years ago, right after the Charlie Crist election. We happened to be the one firm that publicly got it right. Now,
congratulations.
But a little bit was blind squirrel finding a nut. Now, we were modeling the electorate to the best of our ability based on past elections, looking at voter registration trends, and then as the data came in, which is beautiful about, we no longer have election day, we have election month.
Right.
I can look at data as it comes in every day and then model accordingly. Most of the polls that were published that were wrong all got the same thing wrong. They had a higher Democratic turnout than was actually going to happen. We predicted about a 3.5-point gap. Everybody else was drawing it even, and that's why they all predicted Charlie Crist was going to win, and why we found that it wasn't an indication of what I wanted to happen, but I was modeling it based on the actual voters' turnout, and so that's such a critical element. You have to spend time on modeling up front to get a better understanding of what the electorate's going to look like, not what you want it to look like. That's the job of the parties, to reshape the electorate to the maximum extent practicable. So we try to guess based on voter registration trends and past behavior. Now, the last 3 presidential elections in Florida, Democrats turned out a slightly higher number into raw numbers, about a percentage point over Republicans. in the last 3 gubernatorial races, the Democrats and Republicans turned out at 7, 5, and 3.5 points more than Democrats. So Democrats actually closed the gap. This year, Charlie Christine did a good job of closing the gap. Unfortunate for them, they didn't close it enough. And at some level, that's what we're trying to do, Scott. And we do it by age, which is much more predictive, except when a guy named Barack Obama is on the ballot. Younger voters and black voters tend to turn out in higher numbers. But we accounted for that. Right. And we saw some of that activity. So you try to account for what it's going to look like.
That's actually a really good segue to that question.
Oh, good.
Going back to talking about the poll that you completed for the Florida League of Mayors and looking at income, age, and race, what can you tell us, the people on the call today, what was the median income, what was the median age, and what was the median, like in terms of the breakdown between black and white?
Well, we don't use median in polling and because we measure them based on discrete categoricals, okay? We put them in categories. And what we...
So like 18 to 30 or 18 to 25.
Right, so we don't have enough data. We don't have the data structured so that we use median. That's the first question. Secondly, we matched each categorical up to the registered voter population because that's the data we had, and then we looked at census data as well. So what was important there to understand is there were some gaps in income, all right, on different perceptions, but they weren't nearly as important, interesting, or didn't tell us a good enough story to understand that there was a difference by income. What we found, the differences in income were more driven by the differences by race, and what's called a spurious variable. One variable masks another. So we saw differences in income. The computer told us as we run it through, and so at the end of the day, those differences weren't differences of income. They were differences of race. That's what the computer told us. And by age, same thing. A 65-year-old black man and a 65-year-old white man are going to differ because of their race. A 65-year-old white man and a 32-year-old black man are going to differ by their race age. Does that make sense? So I don't have a median number, but we did match each categorical. So if 18 to 34 was 16%, and I think it's actually much higher than that, our poll had 16%, so it looked like really good question because that's critical to make sure that your poll looks like the population you're polling.
Very good. We have one other bullet, just I wanted to touch base on this as you and I were chatting about this earlier last week or so. And any Floridian, we are a battleground state. There are a lot of state legislative districts that are seriously potentially competitive, as well as congressional seats, and got a Senate race. Oh, and there's this presidential race. We're getting phone calls. We're getting robocalls to vote for this candidate. We're getting the, did you know that so-and-so is an axe murderer, and whatever kinds of calls. And we're getting pollster calls. So you're on the side of making those calls. Your team is trying to find out what we, the voters, are thinking. What's your experience these days of how the voters are willing to respond to polls?
It's funny. We shut down about 10 to 12 days out from the election. We finished up a few polls. And a great financial during the primary right. Because an interesting phenomenon started happening. The voter resistance to political communication, in my opinion, and I've been doing this 30 years, was significantly higher than I've ever seen it by which meant we had about 28,000 households and had about 24,000 phone numbers. So guys, keep that number in mind, 24,000 phone numbers. As we were doing our
polls. You're going to draw a sample, a list of
right.
those to call a subset.
Exactly. In theory, I'm supposed to call it a subset that's both random and representative.
Back when I was doing this in the 80s, you're looking at 24,000, you would be thinking about calling maybe 4,000 households.
Exactly. You would call four. In the 80s, you would call, it was a 10-to-1 ratio in the 80s. In the 90s and the aughts, it climbed to about 20-to-1, and it's hovered there, right? And so as voters got more and more polls, because this is a hotly contested race, more and more robocalls, more and more volunteer phone banks, more and more knocking on the door, more and more mail, they started to shut us down. Our ratio at one point rose to 60 to 1.
I mean, 60 calls to get one
completion
interview.
And we were doing 400 sample polls, which meant, anybody that's not a math major, just stay with us here. 6 times 4 is 24. We had 24. We had to call the entire voter database every single night. That, my friends, is what's called absurd. Okay? We were no longer random. We were no longer representative. In fact, who is the last voter, poor sucker, still taking these calls going, okay, I'll take a poll? You had to believe they were different, and the results showed. In this one particular poll, we had been consistently up 10, 12 points, and all of a sudden we had 2 polls where we were dead even. And because everybody freaked out, so what did they do? They did more mail. They wanted to do another poll. We said we're not doing any more polls. We're done. And so, but of course, at the end, all the data show we never lost that 12-point lead. We ended up winning by 15 points. But voter resistance is very high, and it's very frustrating. Now, going into the general, your data file multiplies 8-fold, literally, because you add in the other parties, you add in surge voters, so you have you have open water to start calling again. So, well, at some point, if you get to 60 to 1, it doesn't make any sense what you're calling. But immediately we're back down to 30 to 1.
And I want to reinforce, as we've been making that distinction a little earlier, we're talking about the heat of the election cycle and very hot. So that's the nature of this beast in this present era, with so much communication, so much polling going on during election cycles. We're seeing similar challenges in public opinion research that is not about elections, but not to the magnitude. So I don't want everyone to come away from this and say, oh, it's all crap anyway. But in election polls, there are times when, yeah, so as you said, you just, at a point you shut down and say, we can't give you good data anymore.
Well, we do a lot of polls on a variety of topics for municipalities, for corporations.
Like the policing poll.
Exactly. And so we had a client, we just pulled the plug, and he had a project he wanted us to do 2 polls on, and he wanted it done before Thanksgiving. And we said, listen, I'd love to take your money. I'd love to do the project. It's one of my favorite clients. I said, absolutely not. Let's wait till January till the whole system simmers down a little bit. Because by and large, and people find this hard to believe, there's a lot of people who like to take polls. A lot of people like to express their opinion. They feel like they're being heard. And that's why some people will stay on the phone for 30 minutes. We'll never do a poll more than 15 to 17 minutes. But that's why there's a lot of people like to take polls. And a lot of that ratio isn't people who connect. It's just a matter of getting somebody on the phone.
Right.
Because once you get somebody on the phone, you believe I would have a 1 in 5 ratio, 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 ratio. People who are, oh, okay, I'll take a poll. Happy to take a poll.
But they're blocking all the numbers that they don't know because they're getting all these robocalls and all these volunteers.
Well, then what you have to do is you have to validate. In our case, you have to have validate. You have an actual voter on the phone, and my neighbor could have answered the phone. My 18-year-old kid who hasn't yet registered can answer the phone, and who knows what you're getting.
Did we have any other questions?
The only other one is just about the slides, and I just want to apologize to everyone on the call. The system was not able, for some reason, I couldn't upload it, so I will be emailing the slides out to everybody.
Oh, it's for them to download earlier.
Yeah,
okay.
For some reason, sometimes technology is your friend, and sometimes it's not.
That's true. All right, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us and just let you know what's coming up. Holly mentioned at the beginning, we are starting a series of webinars, a different webinar topic each month. So we'll be coming back to public opinion in December. On December 1st, we'll have our next conversation about what our citizens are thinking. In October, we'll be talking about ethics law. So we have an ethics law update, and then November, we'll be talking about leadership. You can see those dates on the screen. Also want to remind you, as we're moving into the season of the League of Cities Policy Committee meetings, we have a webinar scheduled for September 29th on planning for advocacy success to help prime the pump for thinking about how we're going to move forward in this next legislative session. I want to thank you all for attending, and I especially want to thank Steve for taking the time. Especially, I have to tell you, I pulled him out of the lobby here at Florida League of Cities office in Tallahassee because, of course, there was someone on the phone with him, one of his clients, taking care of this very contested election season. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us, Stephen. We're going to be back together in December, and we're looking forward to that conversation. I want to thank all of you as well for being a part of this. I want to encourage you to stay with us, be a part of these conversations each month as we talk about public opinion in our state, as we talk about leadership, we talk about ethics. Thank you for joining us. This is Scott Payton.